He asked for wisdom and received a crown of fire. He built the house of God and then raised altars for rival gods on the hill east of Jerusalem. The Bible remembers the most brilliant mind of Israel as a man whose heart drifted. That single word explains the legend and the tragedy. Drift. Not a scandal overnight. A slow turn of the wheel, barely noticeable at first, until the ship hit the rocks. Before the gold, before the cedar, before the thunder of worship in Jerusalem, Solomon's story began in a room full of whispers. He was the son of David and Bathsheba, the child named Jedediah by the prophet Nathan, a name that means beloved of the Lord. People repeat the story of the prodigy who solved riddles and wrote proverbs. The text begins with a succession crisis that tasted like iron. David's older son, Adonijah, announced himself king while David shivered with age. Nathan and Bathsheba moved with precision. Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the warrior escorted Solomon to the Gihon spring, anointed him, and blew the trumpet. The ground shook with proclamation, and Adonijah's party collapsed in fear. That opening scene sets the tone. Solomon's reign began with the clash of horns and the cold logic of survival. He took no chances. Adonijah came back with a proposal that exposed his ambition. He wanted Abishag the Shunammite, the young woman who had attended David. In that court, such a request signaled a claim to the throne. The result was fatal for Adonijah. Abiathar the priest was deposed and sent into quiet exile in Anathoth. Joab, David's hardened general, was executed beside the altar after years of blood guilt. Shimei, the man who once cursed David, died for crossing a line he had sworn to keep. Consolidation looked like wisdom to the pragmatic eye. The Book of Kings records it as necessary, ruthless house cleaning that secured the throne but left a stain that never quite washed out. Solomon loved God, the text says, yet he offered sacrifices at the high places because no permanent house for the Lord had yet been built. That sentence in 1 Kings 3 lands like a subtle warning. Love without full obedience breeds compromise. Still, the early sunlight on Solomon's rule felt warm. At Gibeon, where the tabernacle stood, Solomon had a dream. God offered him anything. He asked for a lev shomia, a listening heart, to judge the people with discernment. That request sounded like humility from a king who knew his limits. God granted wisdom, and with it riches and honor. The first courtroom scene that follows, 2 mothers, 1 child turned the nation's attention into awe. His decision moved like a blade through fog. People saw an authority that cut to the truth. Wisdom flowed into infrastructure. Solomon appointed 12 district governors, who provided food for the royal household month by month. The daily provisions listed in 1 Kings 4 read like the inventory of an empire: 30 cors of fine flour and 60 cors of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, plus deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. This was not a rustic camp. This was a machine of abundance. He spoke 3,000 proverbs and composed 1,005 songs. He lectured on botany from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of a wall, and he tracked the habits of beasts, birds, reptiles, and fish. His intel attracted seekers from all surrounding nations. Information was currency. Solomon minted it daily. The building phase turned wisdom into stone, cedar, and gold leaf. Solomon brokered an alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, importing cedar and cypress from Lebanon. 30,000 workers rotated in shifts to the forests. 70,000 carried burdens. 80,000 cut stone in the hills. 3,300 supervised the labor. The temple rose with silent precision, its stones dressed at the quarry. The dimensions were exact: 60 cubits long, 20 wide, 30 high. The inner sanctuary measured 20 cubits cube, overlaid with pure gold. 2 cherubim 10 cubits high stretched their wings across the most holy place. The bronze craftsman cast a massive sea, resting on 12 oxen, along with stands and basins. In such number the text calls the bronze beyond weighing. 7 years for the temple, 13 for the palace. That ratio speaks louder than a sermon. The house of the forest of Lebanon shimmered with cedar beams, 45 pillars in 3 rows, and a hall of judgment where Solomon sat on an ivory throne overlaid with gold. The bronze pillars by the temple entry carried names, Yachin and Boaz, names anchored to moral architecture. He built Millo, fortified Jerusalem, and strengthened Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. An Egyptian pharaoh had burned Gezer and gave it as dowry to his daughter when she married Solomon, a diplomatic gift sealed in ash and marriage. The ark entered its new home during a festival that shook the city. Priests carried it into the inner sanctuary, and a cloud filled the house so the priests could not stand to minister. The glory of the Lord settled there. Kings records the cloud. Chronicles adds that fire fell from heaven and consumed the offerings, and the people bowed with faces to the pavement. The dedication prayer is one of the high points in the Bible's portrait of a leader. Solomon pleaded for God's eyes to be open toward that place, for mercy toward repentant sinners, for the foreigner who would come because of God's great name, for those exiled for disobedience to find a way home through prayer. The text announces that heaven listened, and the blessing landed. Yet even in that moment, the covenant set a condition. God later appeared to Solomon and warned him that if he turned away and served other gods, the temple itself would become a proverb and a byword. Even glory came with a guardrail. Trade and treasure surged. 1 Kings 10 says Solomon's annual gold intake reached 66 talents, a weight that equals roughly 22 metric tons every year, a number that makes modern minds jump because of its echo in Revelation. The text simply counts bullion. Shields of hammered gold lined the walls of the house of the forest of Lebanon. 200 larger shields of 600 shekels each. 300 smaller of 3 minas each. His throne stood ivoried and gilded with 6 steps and 12 lions flanking the ascent. The fleet based at Ezion-Geber on the Red Sea sailed with Hiram's seasoned Phoenician crews, returning every 3 years with gold, silver, ivory, and exotic cargo like apes and peacocks. Horses and chariots rolled in from Egypt and Kuwait, with a chariot priced at 600 shekels and a horse at 150. Deuteronomy had warned Israel's kings against multiplying horses, wives, and silver and gold, and especially against turning back to Egypt for horses. Solomon drove straight through that caution light, confident he could handle speed. The Queen of Sheba arrived with a caravan that whispered of incense before it turned a corner. Her kingdom likely lay in southwestern Arabia, around Saba, in present-day Yemen. Though traditions in Ethiopia claim her too, she tested Solomon with hard questions, measured the words on his tongue, and saw the house he built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the apparel of his servants, and the burnt offerings he offered. The text says there was no more breath in her, meaning amazement took the air from her lungs. She gifted 120 talents of gold and a flood of spices. She came to see if the rumor exceeded reality. Reality exceeded rumor. Later traditions embroidered the visit into romance, thrones, and secret heirs. The Bible does not. It simply records the exchange and the verdict of astonishment. Centuries later, Jesus would say the Queen of the South rose to hear Solomon's wisdom, and something greater than Solomon was present among his audience. That line points forward and backward at once. It also says something about the limits of Solomon's greatness. There was always a ceiling for human brilliance that depended on a truer future king. The archaeology around Solomon's building program sits under debate. Classic excavations at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer identified monumental 6-chambered gates and casemate walls as 10th century works, matching the biblical notice that Solomon fortified those cities. Later scholarship proposed a lower chronology that dated some layers to a later period. The debate keeps the shovels moving. What remains steady is the biblical claim that Solomon's regime centralized power, built strategic fortifications, and turned a tribal confederation into something that behaved like a small empire. His literature matched the architecture. Proverbs opens with the name of Solomon and again credits him in chapters 10 and 25. The latter notes specifically saying the men of King Hezekiah copied those sayings centuries later. The book celebrates wisdom that begins with the fear of the Lord, detests unjust scales, and spares no flattery for fools. Ecclesiastes carries the voice of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, wrestling with vapor and meaning. Song of Songs bears his name, a poem of love that stunned early readers who expected nothing but law and prophecy. Tradition places Solomon's hand near all three, though modern scholars debate authorship and compilation. What the tradition preserves is clear. The wisest king understood beauty and brevity, harvest and heartbreak, the pull of desire and the ruin of pride. The darkness approached in increments. The opening hint lay in 1 Kings 3, where Solomon loved the Lord yet sacrificed at high places. The great high place at Gibeon felt convenient when the tabernacle sat there, but the centralized worship God sought was anchored to his name in Jerusalem. Convenience frequently becomes compromise. After the temple dedication, God warned Solomon plainly, if he turned away, the house would fall. The wealth accelerated, the palaces lengthened, the alliances multiplied. Marriage alliances cemented trade and peace, and that sentence opens the trapdoor. Solomon loved many foreign women. The text says, from nations the Lord had told Israel not to marry, lest they turn the king's heart after other gods. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. This was not romance. It was statecraft multiplied beyond reason. Pharaoh's daughter lived in her own house. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women filled the courtyards and nurseries with the fragrance and music of their homelands. Eventually, the love in his heart drifted from the Lord. The Bible uses that simple phrase again. Drift. The freest mind in Israel drifted. Worship followed the drift. Solomon built high places near Jerusalem, for Chemosh of Moab, and for Molech of the Ammonites, gods labeled abominations in the text. He did the same for Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, and for Milcom, and he allowed his wives to burn incense and sacrifice there. The hill east of Jerusalem, later called the Mount of Corruption, in 2 Kings 23 war, the evidence of his compromise, until a reforming king named Josiah defiled those sites generations later. Moloch worship is linked elsewhere to child sacrifice, and the darkness of those rites haunts the page. Though 1 Kings does not detail such acts under Solomon's watch, the statement is stern enough. The king, who saw into the heart of disputes, turned his own heart to foreign gods. Deuteronomy 17 reads like a test. Solomon began to fail. Do not multiply horses. He gathered horses and chariots. Do not multiply wives. He multiplied them beyond counting. Do not greatly increase silver and gold. Gold flowed in from Tarshish and Ophir, until silver was counted as nothing in the days of Solomon. Do not cause the people to return to Egypt for horses. The chariot pricing in 1 Kings 10 shows a supply line right back through Egypt. The king was supposed to write a copy of the law and read it all his days, so his heart would not be lifted above his brothers. Solomon's heart lifted, then listed, then leaned toward shrines. The catalog of adversaries began to grow. God raised up Hadad the Edomite, who nursed a grievance against David's house. Rezon, son of Eliada, became an adversary in Damascus and hated Israel. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an industrious official in charge of the labor force of the house of Joseph, received a startling word from the prophet Ahijah. Ahijah tore a new garment into 12 pieces and handed Jeroboam 10, announcing that God would tear the kingdom out of Solomon's son's hand and give most of it to Jeroboam because Solomon had not kept God's commandments. 1 tribe would remain for David's line, for the sake of Jerusalem and the covenant with David. The verdict landed. The sentence would be served after Solomon's death. Even mercy moved with consequence. Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak, the Libyan-rooted pharaoh, who would later march north and carve his name onto temple walls at Karnak, with a list of towns he struck in Judah and Israel. Solomon attempted to kill Jeroboam. Wisdom can turn paranoid when it senses the cost of disobedience. It did not matter. The split was set in motion. Solomon reigned for 40 years, the same span as David, with years typically dated from around 970 to 931 BCE. He died and was buried in the city of David. The son who took the throne, Rehoboam, inherited a heavy yoke of taxation and forced labor. He chose harshness over humility, and the northern tribes declared independence with a cry that sounded like a slamming door. The kingdom shattered. The golden shields that had lined Solomon's halls would later be carried off by Shishak, and Rehoboam replaced them with bronze. The metal changed, and the mood with it. The dark truth moves in layers. Solomon was the man who stood before God with a trembling, listening heart. He was the man who penned lines about humility and diligence that still guide business leaders, parents, and students. He was the man who built the temple where God's presence settled in cloud and, according to Chronicles, flame. He was the man who climbed the hill across the Kidron and built high places for gods that Israel's prophets would denounce with tears and fire. The Bible does not flatten him into a villain or canonize him into a saint. The portrait is complex enough to trouble the easy moralist and reassure the honest sinner. Wisdom without obedience corrodes. Success without guardrails accelerates failure with a polished smile. The daily machine of Solomon's court drew admiration and criticism even within the text. 12 officers provisioned the household month by month, each section of the country carrying its turn, a system that felt like efficiency to some and like an unending levy to others. The timber floating down from Lebanon produced vaulted halls and the lingering scent of resin, and it also produced cracks between tribes. The district arrangement ignored older tribal lines, and centralized power tends to breed resistance at the edges. The people came to Rehoboam after Solomon's death and asked for lighter service. That request revealed the pressure that had built under the glamour. The queen who measured his wisdom with riddles saw the sparkle. The prophet who tore a robe measured his failure with strips of cloth. The biblical narrator holds both images at once. That choice protects the story from shallow praise and shallow scorn. The greatest minds collapse when they imagine themselves above the law of the God who granted the mind in the first place. The wisest king slowly turned his heart. That adverb carries the knife, slowly. The turning was not dramatic enough to be corrected by a single brave friend. Not political enough to create immediate revolt, not costly enough to ruin the economy overnight. The turning was patient, plausible, bipartisan, fragranced, and covered in gilded logic. The treasures of Solomon's court carried symbols the later books play with deliberately. Gold so abundant that silver became common. Shields of gold later replaced with bronze. Craftsmen shaping massive objects for worship with the skill of Hiram of Tyre's bronze worker, whose mother was from Naphtali, and father Tyrian, an artisan identity that underlined the Phoenician influence on temple craft. The pillars outside the temple bore names that meant, "He establishes," and "In him is strength." The names outlived the king's fidelity. The lion-flanked throne embodied royal majesty, and also the temptation to forget that the king sat beneath a higher rule. Trade routes turned Solomon into a Mediterranean and Red Sea broker. Azon Geber near Elath, on the shore of Edom, opened paths toward Ophir. Ophir's location remains debated, with suggestions ranging from southern Arabia to East Africa to the Indian subcontinent. The exotic goods algum wood, precious stones, apes, and peacocks tell a story of global curiosity. Wisdom finds connections across borders. Wisdom also rationalizes compromises when the price is profit. The biblical writer offers detail after detail, not as detached economic history, but as spiritual diagnosis. Each number carries a caution. Each alliance tests the covenant vows. The law communicated a principle for kings. The king writes the law for himself and reads it. He does not multiply what is forbidden to multiply. He leads with humility, because he is a brother among brothers, not a god among servants. The prophets will later point back to this standard as they call kings to account. Solomon's heart turned because he multiplied gifts without multiplying devotion. The text uses a phrase that pierces modern pride. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God. Wisdom without wholeness ends in confusion. Cultural memory keeps tugging at Solomon's name. A later Jewish tradition, not in the Bible, imagines Solomon commanding demons with a ring and bending the spiritual world to his will. It is an echo of the desire to control the mysterious, to make everything obedient to brilliance. The canonical portrait resists that fantasy. The true control rested with the Lord, who could tear kingdoms and raise adversaries when the king wandered. The Book of Kings sits with the full complexity of an admired and compromised leader, and lets that complexity judge the reader. Gate building and idol building shared the same timeline. Gold and warning walked in the same hall. The dedication moment remains one of Scripture's most luminous scenes. Solomon stretched his hands toward heaven and asked for forgiveness when Israel sinned, and prayed toward that place. When drought fell, when famine spread, when siege came, when exile happened far away, he even prayed for the foreigner who would come for the sake of God's great name, so that all peoples might know the Lord. That prayer reads like clarity. It also reads like prophecy. Every scenario in that prayer played out in the centuries ahead. Drought, famine, siege, exile. Foreigners drawn because the names sounded different from the names of the nations. He named truths that would hold the nation together under God even when kings fail. The divine response in Kings warned with precision, "If you turn away and serve other gods, this house will become a byword, and people will hiss when passing the ruins." History followed that warning. Centuries later, Babylonians tore down the temple Solomon built. The king's failure did not cause that alone. Generations of drift compounded the problem, but Solomon's choices put cracks in the foundation. His son's heavy hand widened those cracks into a canyon. The northern kingdom erected golden calves at Dan and Bethel under Jeroboam to keep people from returning to Jerusalem to worship. The slide accelerated, and prophetic voices like Elijah and Elisha battled to slow it. The writer of Kings remembers Solomon as the root of the split. The glory and the fracture share the same page. Economics gets specific in 1 Kings 4 and 10, because money and worship often share a ledger. 12 districts fed the king's household. Gold poured in. Gifts from foreign rulers arrived as displays of loyalty and admiration. The state's body grew large and hard to feed. The proverb writer understood ant-like diligence and warned against debt. The king's policies created permanent levies of labor, even if Israelites were technically exempt from the forced labor used for Canaanite remnants. That detail matters. The text calls it a levy that remained, and Jeroboam's role over the labor of the house of Joseph made him a rallying point for the northern tribes. The king whose wisdom solved disputes created policies that became disputes. A deep irony sits inside Proverbs. The book insists on the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. It denounces adultery, idolatry, and pride. Many of those sayings bear Solomon's name. The collection also includes material from other sages and editors, especially the men of Hezekiah centuries later. The presence of Solomon's name at the top of a book that condemns the very sins he later embraced functions as a preserved rebuke to celebrity spirituality. Inspiration coexisted with failure then and now. The God who gives wisdom does not force obedience. The God who gives good things allows idols to arise when gifts replace the giver. The story circles back to the beginning. Solomon asked for a listening heart. The heart that listened to God at Gibeon later listened to the songs of foreign shrines. That sentence does not erase his early devotion. It shows the danger of assuming early devotion protects against late compromise. Discipleship in Israel moved one day at a time, one festival at a time, one covenant reminder at a time. The king was supposed to read the law, write it out, and hear it with fresh ears. He wrote Proverbs, not the whole law. He wrote Psalms, not the daily copy that would have checked the drift. He surrounded himself with wives who bore the names of rival deities, and the constant presence of their worship pressed on him with the steady force of affection and diplomacy. The Sheba moment offers a word about celebrity. Admiration intoxicates. The queen praised God for setting Solomon on the throne and for his justice. Solomon responded with gifts and royal warmth. The exchange closed in mutual satisfaction. The problem began when admiration replaced accountability. The biblical story treasures the way nations came to hear wisdom. It also treasures the courage of prophets like Ahijah to speak against the tide of applause. The presence of both admiration and rebuke keeps the story honest. Ophir's gold, Lebanon's cedar, Egypt's horses, and Israel's songs came together in a single administration. That achievement dazzles until the reader remembers Deuteronomy's guardrails. The biblical author shapes the narrative to show that the guardrails exist for a reason. Even a king like Solomon can blow past them without immediate crash, which is why the warning must be written and read aloud. The crash happened in the next generation. Shishak's campaign lists towns on temple walls. The biblical text says, "He plundered Jerusalem and took the treasures of the house of the Lord and the king's house." Rehoboam swapped gold for bronze. The symbolism is hard to miss. The luster faded, and the weight doubled. The tradition that holds Solomon responsible for much of the wisdom literature ends up functioning as a mirror. Ecclesiastes reads like an old king looking back over palaces and projects and calling them vapor. Everything under the sun collapses without fear of God. Enjoy gifts as gifts. Do not pretend gifts become gods. That is the gospel according to Ecclesiastes. If Solomon did not pen every line, the tradition invites you to let his life interpret the book anyway. The wisest man reached the edge and said that life without reverent obedience is breath on a cold morning. The story also threads hope. The covenant with David did not break, even when the house faltered. God promised a lamp for David in Jerusalem. The prophet's word to Jeroboam included a promise of discipline, not annihilation. Later kings in David's line would rise and fall, some faithful, many not. Prophets would speak of a future son of David who would embody wisdom without drift. Jesus later identified himself as greater than Solomon, a sentence that passes easily until you look at the weight. Greater than the man who built the temple, greater than the man who authored Proverbs, greater than the king who drew nations to his threshold. Jesus spoke in parables that reordered the world and walked a path without compromise. He declared himself the temple and the wisdom of God in flesh. He also warned about a house swept clean and then repossessed by worse spirits if left empty, a line that could sit under Solomon's biography like a caption. King Solomon's name lingers in modern imaginations. Treasure hunters dreamed of his mines, and novelists wrote fantasies about hidden wealth in African deserts. Archaeology uncovered copper production at Timnah and Phanon that likely belonged to Edom, a find sometimes connected in popular talk to Solomon, but not as proof of biblical mines. The science does its work. The myths do their dance. The text stands as a moral biography stitched into history. The wise king turned, and God held him to account. Line up Solomon's crucial numbers and moments, and the shape of the story becomes sharp. 40 years on the throne, 7 for the temple, 13 for the palace, 3,000 proverbs, and 1,005 songs, 666 talents of gold annually, 12 districts feeding the court, 700 wives, and 300 concubines. One temple, one God, and then multiple altars to gods who demanded practices the prophets reviled. One heart at first listening, one heart later divided. His name in Hebrew shares a root with shalom, peace. His reign carried peace, trade, and expansion. This same Solomon created fault lines that produced civil war the moment he died. The text insists on both. This insistence trains the reader to handle power with suspicion and humility. It also trains the reader to receive wisdom as gift and to guard it with obedience. The turning of the heart matters more than the turning of the economy. The direction of worship matters more than the direction of trade routes. The dedication prayer mentions the foreigner, a detail that resonates in a world obsessed with borders and belonging. Solomon asked God to hear the foreigner who would pray toward that house, so that all nations would know the name of the Lord. Idolatry flipped that script. Instead of the nations coming to sing the name of the Lord, Israel's king built altars to the nations' gods. The missionary impulse turned into syncretism. The light on the hill dimmed. The prophets tried to trim the wick. Josiah later tore down the high places Solomon built on the hill east of Jerusalem, a generational repentance aimed at sins baked into the city's skyline. There is a sober comfort in the biblical memory that refuses to airbrush. Solomon's story delivers both inspiration and warning in a single breath. The temple blows, the prayers soar, the songs ring out, and then the altars rise and the heart bends. The writer does not let you escape the tension. Anyone who loves gifts more than God can walk the same path, no matter how many proverbs are written or quoted. The humility of Solomon's early plea remains the path back. A listening heart. Listening led to wise judgment between two mothers. Listening led to a temple dedicated to a God who forgives. Listening would have kept a king from the altars of Chemosh and Molech. Listening still turns a leader back from the brink. The law sat near him. The copy waited to be written, read, and obeyed. The mind was sharp. The heart drifted. The end does not erase the beginning. The beginning indicts the end. The legacy of Solomon in the Bible lives as paradox, a golden age that planted silver mines of sorrow in the next generation, a literary genius whose lines still guide daily schedules and moral choices, and a political architect whose policies snapped the nation's backbone, a temple builder whose design united worship in one place, and a high place builder whose shrines fractured devotion in many. A king whose very numbers shock modern readers into awe and a little envy, and a king whose cautionary end warns any clever heart that cleverness cannot save a compromised soul. The Bible's refusal to flatten Solomon gives the story its power. The narrative has no interest in manufactured heroes. It tells of a God who stays faithful even when kings drift. It tells of a wisdom that begins in reverent obedience and evaporates without it. It tells of a people who learn to measure success not by the size of palaces, but by the posture of the heart before God. It tells of a promise that outlives the failures of brilliant men. A son of David would sit without drift. A temple not made with hands would rise without collapse. Wisdom would walk, speak, and die and rise again. And the Queen of the South would not only come to hear, but to worship the one greater than Solomon. The dark truth about Solomon is not that he was a fraud. He was real, gifted, generous, focused, and fiercely intelligent. The dark truth is more tragic and more common. He loved God, and then loved other loves more. He wrote wisdom, and then tried to live above it. He led with brilliance, and then slipped into the old darkness of convenience and compromise. The temple's gold reflected the face of a king whose heart reflected too many altars. The point does not land on scorn. It lands on trembling. Solomon's biography is a mirror that says, brilliance needs boundaries. Blessing needs obedience. Beauty needs loyalty to the God who grants it. The footnotes of numbers, ships, shrines, and songs tell the story in detail. The headline is simple. Start with a listening heart and keep listening. The rest of the story depends on that line.